Hey everyone, I am Ian Plant, your host of PhotoMasters Live, and today I am joined by one of my favorite landscape photographers. He is an excellent landscape pro, Sean Bagshaw, out of the Pacific Northwest. For those of you who do not know him, definitely go and check out his website, check out his photos. We'll be sharing a lot of his great photos today in this presentation. Sean, welcome to PhotoMasters Live.
Thanks, Ian. I'm excited to be here.
All right, fantastic. Today, we are going to be talking about using weather creatively in landscape photography. So if anyone has any questions during the presentation, just go ahead and put them in the chat. The speak function isn't enabled for this, so unfortunately, we can't use that function. So just put any questions you have in the chat, and we will be monitoring the chat as much as we can. If you're looking for the poll, there should be a little space where you can go and click on the poll. It should be right under the chat option. And you can answer our poll question really quick if you want to. So we're going to be talking today about the creative use of weather in landscape photography. And, you know, a lot of times landscape photographers talk about chasing the light, but I feel like we're not really chasing the light. What we're doing most of the time is chasing the weather, chasing the clouds. But actually what we're doing, it seems to me, Sean, and let me know if you have some different thoughts about this. I feel like we're chasing moisture. That's really what we're looking for, because the moisture is what creates clouds, but moisture also creates these other amazing weather events like lightning, like rainbows, like snow, like mist and fog. If you don't have moisture in the air, you're not going to have any of these things. And these amazing weather events are what bring life to our landscape photos and allow us to tell the story of the landscape. What do you think about that, Sean?
I like that. I think that's a really useful, helpful way to think about it. I'm not sure I ever thought about it, but now that you say that we're chasing moisture, I think that's really the case. And moisture comes in so many different forms, and it interacts with light in so many different ways that a lot of, those weather elements and those light elements do come down to moisture in the atmosphere. So I guess we're lucky that we live on a wet water planet.
In many ways. And you know, I honestly feel like the moisture in the sky affects the quality of the light. And to me, like the light that everyone thinks is the most exciting for landscape photography, or that they think is going to be the most colorful, is light on a clear sunny day. They think of obstructions in the sky as something that blocks the light. But in my personal experience, you get better quality light when you've got something in the sky, like you've got clouds. And, you know, you want to have clearing where the light is breaking through, but clouds everywhere else will act as giant reflectors, and they'll bounce light down onto the landscape. And so that's when you get that really amazing light on the landscape, is when you've got like partly to mostly cloudy skies, maybe just a little thin sliver on the horizon where the sun is breaking through and lighting up the landscape. But then you've got the clouds also lighting up at the same time, and they're bouncing that light down onto the landscape as well. And that's when you seem to get the most intense, the most colorful, and the most otherworldly light.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think non-photographers and people maybe when they first get into photography, exactly what you said, when you're thinking about light, I think there's two things that dealing with we think, oh, you want clear sky, maximum light. But two things about that are, first of all, the most intense light, when we just see a bright sunny day, our eyes see, lots of light, and we think, oh, that looks great to our eyes. That also looks great to the camera. But the reality is that cameras do a lot better, I find, with more subtle and nuanced lighting. Mm-hmm. And like you said, so the moisture in the atmosphere, clouds, or whatever it is, fog, and diffusing that lighting really is helpful in photography. The other thing is that all light really isn't great for photography. I find it's the interaction between light and shadow. And so if you've just got a clear blue sky and everything is equally lit, that's not nearly as interesting whereas when you have, kind of a variation or a transitions between light and shadow. So whether that's clouds placing areas of shadow onto the landscape, or whether that's the sky itself has variations of light and shadow because of clouds and things. So those are two, I think, really important aspects. around light that weather affects that I think when people first start, they just think, oh, the more light, the better.
Right. Yeah, no, I like the way you put that. And I think that's very true. And I'm thinking back to some workshops I recently did in Badlands National Park in South Dakota. And I'll be sharing some of my recent work from there while we go into the presentation, which will start very soon. And I remember there are moments when there's some clouds in the sky blocking the light. And then all of a sudden the light breaks through and it's really strong light, but it feels like the light's a little too harsh. Like it's just too clear. I kind of like it a little bit better when it's a little bit filtered by the moisture in the sky, when you've got a little bit of cloud or even fog or mist. That softer light can often be very colorful, but it's just not as harsh, and it's easier to deal with the contrast. And I think sometimes you get that as you said, that subtle transition between light and shadow. So the shadows are still there; they're just not so deep. And as a result, you've got some detail in the shadows. So I think that softer filtered light can be very beautiful and very colorful. A lot of times that filtered light will be a bit more colorful than if it were just straight light hitting the landscape. So I do like strong, powerful light for certain types of shots, but for a lot of landscape photos, I'm looking for that softer filtered light instead.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And yeah, and so it's really interesting to think about how the weather interacts with the lighting, because without weather, if we were on the moon or Mars where there was no atmosphere, you'd have, other than the direction, I guess, and the angle of light would change. But other than that, the light would be just consistent all the time.
Yeah.
And it's the fact that we have weather that's so variable and has so many different aspects to it and all these different ways that it interacts with that light that, to me, makes landscape photography interesting. If I went out every time and got the exact same situation, exact same conditions every time I was out photographing, I think it would lose interest for me pretty quickly.
Yeah, no, I think it's funny how you kind of pose the hypothetical of doing photography on the moon or Mars. I've often, fantasized about being on the first SpaceX crew that goes to Mars as the resident photographer. But then I kind of check myself and ask, well, what is it that I'm going to photograph? I mean, first of all, I don't think it would be that exciting trying to photograph in a spacesuit or something like that. But without that weather that we have on Earth, I feel like the photography subjects wouldn't be that interesting. I think I'd be kind of bored as a landscape photographer on Mars. So I do think that, as you said, it's great that we live on a wet planet for many reasons. And it really is where the magic in landscape photography is. It's in good old fashioned H2O in moisture itself. And I think we can prove that with the photos that we've chosen for the presentation. So I'm going to actually dive into the presentation in just a moment. But it looks to me, the poll that the clear winner for favorite weather event is storm clouds. We've got some folks who also really like mist and fog, but 41% of respondents say that they like storm clouds. That's their favorite weather event. I tend to agree. I mean, I love rainbows. I love lightning. I love snow. Mist and fog is always fun, but give me storm clouds and I'm as happy as a clam. How about you, Sean? What's your favorite?
Yeah, I always say that I like, fog and mist to me is just always magical. And I like what's called kind of unsettled or kind of variable weather. If I can be on the edge of a weather system, where either weather's coming in or weather's going out. And so you've got kind of transitions happening and, that weather where it's just changing minute by minute. I love that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the key thing for landscape photography is you've got to learn to become an amateur weather forecaster. And you've got to learn to embrace the bad weather because, I mean, sure, if it's just going to rain straight for 5 or 6 days, that's pretty bad. But on the edges of that weather event, that's where the magic's going to happen. And so, for you and I and for other landscape photographers, the worst thing that you can see in the forecast isn't rain, it's sun. It's unrelenting sun. There are some specific types of shots that work with that kind of light. But by and large, we're looking for those transition weather events. And all right, let's go into the slides and we can talk more about this as we talk about the images. And so starting off is one of yours, Sean. Tell us a little bit about this shot. I think it's pretty obvious what's going on here, but give us the background, please.
Yeah, so this is obviously winter. And this is in the Kettle Mountains in the northern part of the state of Washington, right up near the Canadian border, and some elevation, and during a real cold snap that they were having there. And I think what you said earlier, Ian, about this idea that we need to, to really get interesting weather conditions as landscape photographers, we have to be willing to go out in those conditions. It's wonderful to always be able to go out when it's the perfect temperature and everything, there's no wind, but that doesn't always make, the most interesting photographs. And this particular area of this forest is just along a road in the Kettle Mountains that we were driving in the winter. And to drive through there at any other time is very pretty, but not necessarily photogenic. But the fact that it was 0 degrees Fahrenheit and that there had been some kind of intermittent fog blowing through the area at this extreme cold for an extended period of time, that all these, I think they're larch trees actually, that hadn't quite dropped their needles through the winter yet. We're just picking up this wonderful coating of really, thick frost all over them. And then that combined with the interaction with the light, it was just beautiful. But photographing at 0 degrees, and for you and other people that are in the North, Midwest, and the Northeast, get even colder conditions than we get out here in the Northwest. But yeah, photographing for me at 0 degrees, trying to keep your hands warm, trying to not have your lens freeze up or fog up or whatever. Challenging. And normally, even just driving in the mountains in these conditions, it was been snowing, it was icy, but being out there in those conditions, made this photograph possible that wouldn't be possible any other time.
Yeah. So what we call 0 degrees here in Minneapolis, we call that summer.
Yeah, I know. Like I said, I always feel lame talking about my winter photography here in Oregon or in Washington, where if it's 20 or 25 degrees, oh, that's freezing cold. And I know that's a nice balmy day for a lot of people.
Oh yeah, it's time to put on the shorts. But what you're describing here is a day that's cold, but also there's a lot of moisture in the air. And those days feel a lot colder than if you've got dry cold. And so I can understand that would have been a really challenging shot. And I think this is a beautiful image, and I think it illustrates my frustration with winter photography very well, because everyone who doesn't do a lot of winter photography gets really excited about the idea of doing winter photography. They get really excited about snow, but 99 times out of 100, snow doesn't actually look good on the landscape. You need a lot of snow. You need fresh snow. You need the snow to kind of coat and cover everything for it to be really nice for winter photography. And so something like this isn't actually the snow. This is like hoarfrost forming from the mist kind of blowing through on a freezing day. But it's great because it coats everything. And that is when the landscape in winter can be really, really beautiful. But most of the time, if you don't get a lot of thick snow or you don't have fresh snow, you just got like dirty snow. You've got all sorts of ugly sticks and twigs. You've got dirty snow. You've got footprints in it. You've got stuff that's landed on it. It doesn't look good. So you've got to be really, really picky about your snow images. And we just had a real quick question come in from Mark Jordan. He's asking if this is a desaturated image or is it a black and white conversion?
It's actually neither. This is the true color. So just those conditions of that hoarfrost. The hoarfrost was just white. And then, the bark of these tree trunks was very dark. It's probably not exactly monochromatic. There's probably a little bit of color in there, but it really comes across. The raw file is very monochromatic. I worked with making some tonal adjustments and that kinds of thing, working with contrast. And also that one tree, I really worked with kind of brightening the exposure on that tree and then allowing the trees in the background to be a little darker in the way that I developed it to let that one tree kind of come forward. But in terms of color, yeah, this is full color and it's true color.
Yeah. I mean, when you have a landscape like this where it's basically just, everything is covered in that snow or hoarfrost, it's basically everything is very monochromatic to begin with. So you've got a lot of white, you've got a lot of gray. And the only way you're going to reveal color in a landscape like that is if you have light on it. So if it's an overcast day, then you've just got a lot of flat gray light illuminating the landscape. And so if you actually have sunlight, you'll get some color in the shadows, or you'll get color on the landscape where the light's hitting if there's actual, like if it's at sunrise or sunset. Also, the only other way you might reveal color is your choice of white balance. So, you very well could have chosen like a cooler white balance here, for example, to make everything look a little bit more blue, or you could have warmed it up. But I like the very neutral color balance that you chose here. I think it's perfectly appropriate for the scene.
Thanks. And I'm just going to mention one. Oh, anyway.
So it's quite all right. I'll go back.
Not specific about this image. And I think this is a point that'll probably come up a lot as we're talking here today, Ian. But I just want to point out that for a lot of photography, and when we're talking about weather, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about, forecasting and planning for weather and things like that. But I find that so much of weather and light in the landscape is one of those things where you just have to be out there. And this is a great example of, like, I had no way to anticipate this photo other than to be out driving through the Kettle Mountains on this particular day in the winter. I didn't know that the fog was hitting up in this area of the forest until I got there. I didn't know what the hoarfrost situation was. I didn't know what the light situation was. I knew it was cold, but other than that, it was a surprise. And I found it, it was a found photograph, not a planned one at all. And so I think, we can do a lot of planning, but that a lot of working with light and weather in the landscape is you just got to be out there in it, whatever it is, in all conditions.
Yeah. And I think that's especially true when you've got weather that's moving in. So this photo was taken while I was leading one of my workshops in Badlands National Park. And I dragged my clients out that afternoon because I saw that there was some weather moving in, some clouds moving in, and there was a chance of precipitation. And so the reason I do that is because I know that when the weather is moving in, there's a chance that there might be some interesting light, there might be some breakthrough light or something like that. And that if there's any rain in the forecast, there's the possibility of getting rainbows. So we're out there and it starts raining on us. So I told the clients, okay, let's go back to the cars so that we can get out of the rain, but let's be ready to go, because when that rain ends, if there's some clearing sky behind those rain clouds, then we might get a rainbow. And so everyone was sitting in the car and I'm watching the sky and I can see that the sun's beginning to come out. It's still raining really hard. So I dragged everyone out of the cars and they're like, what are you doing? It's still raining. I'm like, we're going to have a rainbow here in just a second. And boom, right after I said it, this beautiful double rainbow appeared. And so we all scrambled to take some shots. And it was tricky because it was still raining pretty hard. So I've got some shots of the double rainbow where I had just water all over my lens. And so I had to take a moment to wipe the lens down. And at that point, the rainbow had begun to fade, but there was still a nice strong rainbow. So I managed to snap this shot really quickly. And so your secret weapons when you're photographing a rainbow are the following. First of all, you need rain. You can't have a rainbow without moisture in the sky. So the rain is either it's got to be raining on you and the sun's just beginning to break out, or it's got to be where it's just stopped raining on you, but it's still raining somewhere in the distance, not too far from you. And so you're going to see the rainbow opposite where the sun is. And so you need to make sure that you've got your back to the sun to see the rainbow. And the second secret weapon for photographing rainbows is to use a polarizer filter. So a polarizer is designed to remove reflections. And a rainbow is not exactly a reflection. It's a refraction in the sky, but it's kind of the same thing, really. And so a polarizer, as you spin it around, you can actually remove the rainbow. But if you keep spinning, you can actually enhance the rainbow, make it look stronger. It'll pop out more. And basically what's happening there is you're not polarizing the rainbow, you're polarizing the sky behind the rainbow, but it will make that rainbow pop out more. Now, I was using a ultra wide angle lens with a bulbous front end. So I wasn't able to make that rainbow stand out with a polarizer. But you can also enhance the rainbow in post-processing, kind of get that same polarized look. just by giving the sky a little extra dehaze, using the dehaze slider. That really makes that rainbow and those stormy clouds pop out quite nicely. So, you just have to be out there when that weather is going on. Even though it was about 2 hours before sunset, like, as a landscape photographer, we get into the habit of just going out there for the golden hours, the magic hours. I was out there early knowing that because there was some weather going through, that we might have something interesting. So another great weather event that wasn't included in the poll is wind. Wind can be very exciting depending on where you are, especially in coastal environments. So Sean, tell us about this image.
Yeah, so this is giant waves breaking on the Oregon coast. And this is a fairly well-known area because the waves do this somewhat consistently. But yeah, wind blowing across the ocean creates waves. And obviously, when those waves hit the shore, they can do all kinds of spectacular things. In this case, those waves were coming in during, I don't know if it's the same weather system that created the waves out in the Pacific somewhere, but it was also on a very kind of stormy, overcast day. So the kind of this really tumultuous ocean combined with the, the kind of moody, stormy weather really works well together. But you can also be in perfectly nice, calm, gorgeous weather and be also getting big waves, because the wind that created those waves may have happened thousands of miles away out on the ocean somewhere, and those waves travel in. And I know that was the case. I was on the island of Oahu this winter on the North Shore, and giant waves coming in, and the weather was perfect. The wind was somewhere far away where those waves were being generated, up in the Gulf of Alaska or somewhere. But yeah. So to be able, though, again, with conditions like that, to be able to kind of monitor wind on the ocean, waves, swell forecasts, and find out when and where they're going to hit. And that's one of the great things that I think about waves is, the weather itself is somewhat unpredictable. I mean, it's predictable to a point, but until you actually get there and see the weather, you don't always know. Waves, on the other hand, once the wind has created the wave action, and those waves are traveling across the ocean, nothing's going to stop them. They're going to keep on coming until they hit land. And they also go by various buoys through the ocean that we have that can give us information on how big those waves are, how fast they're traveling. And so the forecasting for waves and where they're going to be and how big they're going to be and what direction they're coming from are very, very accurate. So whenever we see forecasts for that, big waves coming in to this point, this is Cape Arago, Shore Acres on the Oregon coast. This is also a known spot where you can go, and when that wave, a large swell hits those rocks, the wave itself explodes more than 100 feet up into the air. And I don't know if people can see, if you look closely on the right hand side, there's a fence, and there are people standing at the fence. And you can see their scale compared to the size of that wave explosion. It's pretty incredible.
Well, we got a question from Ron. He wants to know what lens, f-stop, and shutter speed you used for this photo. And I think the f-stop's probably not terribly relevant, but the shutter speed, I think, is the most important variable here.
Yes. So I'm going to guess that this was with because I don't have the data right up in front of me, but I'm going to guess this was probably with like a 24-70 millimeter lens. And so somewhere in the probably 50 to 70 millimeter focal range. I mean, that wave is a little ways away from me, but you can actually get fairly close to them in this location. So you don't have to use too much telephoto. And again, because that wave, the white water of that wave is probably 100 feet up in the air, you have to have a fairly wide angle view to take it all in. Aperture, everything's out kind of at infinity, so not super critical, but I was working with aperture and ISO on this kind of dark, overcast, stormy day to get a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the wave action there, because I didn't want this to be kind of a blurry soft wave. I wanted you to see the power and kind of the explosiveness of it. It's always a case of kind of experimenting with shutter speeds, but I'm going to say this is probably in the maybe like 100th of a second to maybe like a 300th of a second, somewhere in there. That's usually fast enough to freeze this kind of water motion.
Yeah,
And the
and
faster you go, the more frozen it is, and the slower you go, and it's fun to kind of experiment with different shutter speeds to see what the effect is on the wave motion in the image. And then I a lot of times shoot a bunch of different shutter speeds and then pick the one I like best later.
Yeah, and you really need to experiment because the shutter speed that you will need to arrest the motion of the wave will depend on how big the wave is and how powerfully it's slamming against the shore. So something that like a huge wave like this that's coming in with a lot of power and energy, you probably need that 1/250th of a second or 1/500th of a second of a shutter speed to freeze the action, while a smaller wave, 1/15th or 1/30th of a second, might be sufficient.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about this next photo. It looks like you got a little bit of fog, just a hint of fog, and that really helps separate the background from the foreground in this photo.
This is the redwoods on the Northern California coast, which is not too far from where I live, and I love exploring that area. But my favorite conditions to photograph in forests is with kind of a light fog. And finding fog in the forest, it depends on where you are. Some places it's a fairly common event, and other places it's very rare. The redwoods, it's fairly common. But a light fog, like you pointed out, Ian, in this case, I love because it does create some kind of separation. It allows the background to kind of smooth out and not be as distracting, diffuses the light, but it also doesn't obscure the forest. To go into the forest with a very dense fog can also offer some great photographic opportunities, but it can also create much more flat light. It can obscure some of the forest details that you might want to be able to photograph. So a light fog lets some light through, like is happening here. You can see those highlights on the trees and on the ferns, and yet you still kind of get that soft, diffuse effect, almost like a nice glow to it, and you can still see plenty of details. So anytime I find fog like this, and I'm in a forest situation, I definitely am heading out. And again, this is another one of those times where outside of the forest, this is kind of a pretty drab, dreary, foggy day on the Northern California coast. And you might be wherever you are thinking, there's no good photography to be had right now. But when I see those kind of drab, dreary, low fog sort of days, I head to the forest.
So is the highlight glow here entirely natural, or did you maybe add a little bit of an Orton effect to push it along? I
did use a slight what I call soft light glows. When we say Orton effect, that's it's another term that we use for it. The Orton effect is kind of a specific idea where there's many, many different ways to do soft light glows. And so this is some sort of soft light glow technique that I used in Photoshop, but really just to enhance the light and the fog that was there. Not to create anything that wasn't there. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So this next photo was from my recent trip to the Badlands. And, one thing I love working with is modeled light, mixed light. When you've got mostly cloudy skies and you have these moments where the light just breaks through a little bit. And usually what I'm hoping for with that kind of mixed lighting is a spotlight effect. So when I'm shooting landscapes, I would love to have the background landscape spotlit by a little bit of light that's breaking through. So I'm very strategic, waiting for the moment. And a lot of times I want my foreground to be in shadow. I want that progression from dark to light, from shadow to light. And so having that spotlighting on the background is so vitally important. So for this particular shot, once again, this was actually in the middle of the day. I mean, normally we don't think of landscape photography as being something you want to do in the middle of the day, unless maybe it's overcast or foggy out and you're doing forest or stream photography. For the most part, we're focusing on those magic hours of sunrise and sunset. And so when I see the storm clouds building up in the Badlands, I've got a pretty good understanding of the local weather effect. When I know that there's going to be a lot of mixed clouds and these storm clouds are going to be building up, I go out there, and while the storms are building, I know I can get some of these, these mixed lighting effects. So for this particular shot, I was out there working with my clients, and we set up on this one particular composition. There was this dry wash down below that was leading through the grassy prairie, and there were these colorful mounds of clay stone that had some yellows and some pinks and some reds on them. And the wash was leading through that. And I was telling my clients, all right, we need to wait for the moment for the light to break out, but we want to make sure that we have light on the background, not on the foreground. And, there was a moment where it kind of lit up everything. And I was like, okay, take the shots, but this isn't the moment we're waiting for. We're waiting for that cloud to come back in and block the light on the foreground. And when that happened, when the foreground went into shadow, but we still had that spotlighting on the background, that was the moment when the whole thing came together. And that's when everything looked the most colorful. So, I'm always really, waiting for those edge of light events, for those mixed lighting events. I think you can get a lot of great shots. You can get some great shots even in the middle of the day when the light isn't very colorful. When you've got those storm clouds, I like to call it storm light. And I love chasing storm light.
Yeah.
So going on to the next image, back to Sean. Tell us a little bit about this. And we are over halfway through the presentation, and we're not halfway through our images. So I think we need to speed things up a little bit, Sean, if you don't mind.
All right, we'll move along here. So this is in the Faroe Islands, which are small windswept islands, kind of in between Iceland and Norway, and the weather there is notoriously cloudy and windy and rainy. And we were there for a week several years ago when I visited the Faroe Islands. And we knew that we weren't going to see sunlight very much, but we knew we were going to see lots of clouds and storms, stormy conditions, which was great. We were very happy to photograph the moody light, but we still went out kind of at sunrise every morning just in case. And on this one particular morning, the sun there was a small gap near the horizon that the sun could just come through at sunrise. And for about 5 minutes, we had color and light coming through the moody storm clouds that were always hanging there. And, like I said, this was kind of a morning ritual. We'd go out and not expecting much, but it paid off because this one morning, the one morning out of a week, we did get that little bit of light. And I made sure that before that sun was cresting the mountains back there, that I was already in this particular spot. And from a little bit of planning and knowing where the sun was going to come up, if the sun did make an appearance, I knew that the reflection of the sun would come between those rocks the way that it is there. So this was a somewhat planned out situation, but it very easily, could not have all come together. So it kind of was a case of being in the right place at the right time and taking my chances. But when you've got those really moody, stormy conditions and you do get a place for light to come through, then you can really get a lot of magic happening.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, what makes this shot is the sky, the shapes that are formed by the clouds, the colors in the sky. Without that, this shot becomes a lot less effective. And I think this is a really good example of how what's going on in the sky, how important that is to landscape photography. I think arguably it's more important than the landscape itself. I'm always talking about how, as a landscape photographer, you've got to learn to stop seeing the landscape. You're pushing the landscape to the background of your landscape composition, and you're creating a composition that is built around that landscape. So you've got the foreground elements and you've got the sky, and you've got to get the shapes of both to work with that landscape in the background to really sort of direct and focus the viewer's attention on that background scenery. So here, you've got that great foreground, you've got the great color and shape in the sky, and all these things are working together. The landscape itself is really not the most important part of this composition, I think it's fair to say. And here's another shot from the Faroes from Sean. And, I've seen this sort of thing where the wind is blowing so hard that waterfall is blowing up instead of falling down.
Yeah, you get backward waterfalls when the wind's like that. And this is a great example. Again, I mean, this is a very well-known photograph. I think, at this point, I doubt very many people haven't seen a photograph of this location, because in the Faroe Islands, this is a place, it's, obviously photogenic. It's fairly easy to get to. You actually fly right past it on the approach to the airport at the island. You see it out the plane window. So I wasn't planning to even take a photograph here because it's so photographed. I felt like, what else did I really have to bring to this scene? But when you're visiting a place, I still visit all of these locations, whether I plan to photograph them or not. But when I got there, and again, I saw the moody weather with some light coming through, and these just very dramatic waves crashing against the cliffs. And then I saw that waterfall going backward. I was like, all right, I'm getting the camera out. I have to photograph this.
Yeah, and the fact that you had some breaking in the clouds and some color and some light coming through is so critical. Because I've been to the same spot on a day where it was windy like this, and the waterfall was going backwards. But I was there on a day that was completely flat overcast, and so the photographs that I took on that day just weren't interesting because the sky wasn't interesting. So having that interesting light in the sky is so critical. But even on a day that's really flat and overcast, you can still make effective images if you're creative with your technical choices, with your exposure. And so here's another shot. Is this also from the Faroes?
Also from the Faroes, more of that similar, like you said, flat, low, overcast sky that we had day after day.
But here you were creative with your shutter speed. You did a long exposure to blur the water so it looks like fog rolling around. And you chose a really dark exposure. So you took that sort of flat overcast sky and brought the whole exposure value down, creating this sort of moody artistic image.
Exactly. And that was kind of when we went to the Faroes, and I knew that we were going to be having a lot of conditions like this. So I embraced it, and I just said, all right, so I'm going to do a lot of dark, moody photography while I'm there. And that's fine because that's the situation. That's the conditions. This is what it felt like to me. I wish I could take credit for the shutter speed, but I was with a photographer friend, Josh Merrill. Do you know Josh, Ian?
No, I do not know Josh.
He's from Chicago, great photographer, wonderful guys. Anyway, a good friend, fun to travel with him and my other friend, Rainer Serwinski. We were all three there together. And we were here photographing this scene, and the light was fine, my exposure was fine, but I wasn't loving how the ocean was looking in that moment. And it was it was Josh that put on like a 10-stop ND filter and got, I don't know, like a 2 or 3 minute long exposure. And I saw what he did, and I was like, oh, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, that's the way to go. So all credit to Josh for the exposure time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's great to get inspiration from other people. That's part of the pleasure of photographing with other people, is seeing how they're interpreting the world, and sometimes it can spark some creativity in yourself. So I always think it's a good idea to shoot with other people. And this next image is, so I don't bring filters with me for the most part. I love working with these ultra wide angle lenses that have got these big bulbous front elements, and using filters on them is very difficult and expensive. So I kind of gave up on filters. So I don't do much of that long exposure photography unless I'm working in really dark conditions. So it happens naturally. And so I miss out a lot of the time because I think there's a lot of creative effect you can get using neutral density filters. But, for me, I'm really out there to capture those ephemeral moments. And, I'm waiting for that break in the weather, that edge of the weather, a little bit of light and color breaking through. And sometimes those moments are very fleeting. Like with this particular shot, there was this amazing stormy sky in the Badlands, and the light broke through for just a few minutes. And so I had all this beautiful color just painting the sky and also bouncing down onto the landscape itself. And it was really revealing the color and the texture of the landscape. And I barely had enough time to find a good composition. I was lucky that I kind of had something in mind, and I was able to get up there to it and execute it very quickly because this light was very, very fleeting. And so for a shot like that, using a neutral density filter would have been kind of out of the question, because by the time I got the neutral density filter on and did, one exposure, the color would have been gone. So either I would have gotten a good shot with it, or I would have missed it entirely. So, a lot of times when you're working with this fleeting light, you don't have much time to react. If you've got like 30 seconds or 1 minute of light or even less, you kind of got to be ready to go. Sorry?
Oh, I was going to say, I just think that's such an important point that you just made there about kind of scouting and knowing some different compositional ideas ahead of time. I think that is such an important tip for people. On workshops, I see a lot of people that go plant their tripod. There's no interesting light. So they just kind of are standing and waiting for something to happen.
Yeah.
Or they get locked into one place and the light happens in a different place. And they had a composition set up that's not working with the current light. And like you said, when it's fleeting, by the time they find something else, it's gone. So I use the time when I'm at a location that there's not good light. That's my scouting time. And I'm not photographing. I'm going around looking for, there's a composition, and I have several in mind so that when if the light does do something incredible for a short period, I can quickly go to a spot that's going to work for where that light is. And I've already got it figured out. And so I can react because as we know, it happens quickly. And if you're not able to respond in a brief period of time, you miss it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. When I'm leading workshops, I always tell people, okay, while we're scouting for shots, look for composition A, composition B, composition C, D, and so on, and find these different compositions in the area that you're working that point in different directions, because you never know where the clouds are going to be. You never know where that color and light is going to break through. You know where the sun is setting or the sun is rising. But, for like this shot, for example, the sun was setting to the left of where I was set up, but all the color was basically kind of in the north of the sky and also to the right of me in the east of the sky. So it wasn't exactly where you might have expected it to be at sunset. It wasn't showing up where the sun was going down. And so I had to react very quickly to find a composition that worked with the color and the interesting clouds where they were in the sky. So having a bunch of shots that you kind of set up ahead of time, so when it does happen, you can be like, okay, composition A is not going to work. That was my favorite composition, but the light's not working with it. But composition C, that points in the right direction. I can make that happen. That's really important to do. We had a question from Mark Jordan. He wanted to know what month in the Badlands for this shot. So this particular shot was in May. My favorite times to shoot in the Badlands are May, June, and July, because that's during the summer thunderstorm season. So when the storms start to build up in the Badlands, that's the most exciting time to be there. I think you've got kind of a similar season working on the coast. You've got some times of the year where you're more likely to get these amazing, spectacular sunsets, right, Sean?
Yeah, and the Oregon and Washington coast it's counterintuitive, but it's, I guess, one of the benefits of living in a place and getting to know the weather patterns. I think a lot of people come to the Oregon coast in the summertime thinking, okay, summer, that's when the weather's going to be good. But what we have in the summer is a marine layer that sits right offshore. It's this thick layer of clouds and fog that are right down on the ocean. And the warmer the inland gets, that creates an air rise inland, and that sucks that marine layer closer and closer to shore. And what that means is you almost never get a sunset because, the sun's going down, the light's looking great. And then right at that moment when you're wanting this kind of light, the sun goes into that marine layer and the color and light just dies instantly. So the best sunsets on the Oregon coast are typically from October until about May, when it's colder inland and that marine layer doesn't get pulled in like that. And then this particular situation, this was in December in Crescent City, was a really, really stormy day. A huge weather system was moving in. It had been raining for days. And just flat overcast and not really good photography situation. But I had looked ahead at the weather, and as I was heading actually out to the coast to do a Photo Cascadia meetup, and I knew we were going to be there on the coast. And I also saw that this weather system was the end of it was coming, and it looked like the tail end of the weather system was going to time itself with sunset. So that meant all these stormy clouds would be over the top of the land, but somewhere out there to the west where the sun was setting, the clouds ended and there was an opening where the sun could come through. We didn't know. We drove through the worst rain conditions you can imagine, arrived right at sunset, and sure enough, that gap was out there and the light came streaming through. It was just good timing. If that end of that storm system was passing through an hour earlier or an hour later, this wouldn't have happened.
Well, we just had a comment. Someone said that they love how you process your photos. Is there anywhere they can go to learn more about your photo processing?
Well, strangely enough, thank you. First of all, thank you very much. I have a YouTube channel where I do a lot of sharing of Photoshop techniques and Lightroom techniques and things like that. That's all free. You can just look me up on YouTube, but also at my website, which is outdoorexposurephoto.com. That's a long URL, I know. So you could just Google Sean Bagshaw and you'll find it as well.
I just put a link in the chat.
Oh, and Ian very nicely put a link in the chat. I have a whole series of courses actually on image developing and Photoshop techniques and things like that that I use in my work. And so if anybody's interested in checking that out, in fact, I'd like to have let me see if I still have it on here. I can put in the chat a code. Yep, there it is. So for anybody who's not familiar with my courses and like to check them out, I just put a code there in the chat for 15% off anything on my website, any of my courses. And that also includes the TK panel.
Yeah, and if you're interested in learning about my photo processing style, I'm a little bit more of a light touch than Sean is with the processing. But you can check out my PhotoMasters website, and right now I've got a subscription service that I've just launched called PhotoMasters Pro that gives you access to my growing library of courses that include field courses and digital processing courses. And I just launched what I call the digital processing channel on PhotoMasters Pro. So basically, whenever I get back from a trip and I've got new images, I bring you into the digital darkroom with me to show you how I process those photos from start to finish. So it's, very much a living thing, this subscription on PhotoMasters Pro. And I think it's a great value and it's a growing value. And we are beginning to run out of time. So I think I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit because we are just talking so much. Let's talk about this image really quick, and we'll maybe share a few more photos before we wrap things up today, Sean.
Okay, we'll start going speed round.
Yeah.
Again, talking about moisture in the atmosphere, one of the things that I love are kind of rare, not rare, but unusual, less common. And one thing that I love is a sundog, or I think also is called a glory. Basically, it's a reverse rainbow. It's a ring around the sun. So instead of having the sun behind you, you're looking towards the sun, and you just have the right kind of moisture and ice crystals in the high atmosphere to create this, again, sort of optic refraction of the light. Mm-hmm. And so you get that ring around the sun, and it can just be a wonderful compositional element. I've seen these used in various ways in landscape photography. I always think they're really special.
Yeah, this is a fantastic image. And what I love about the halo is it's basically like a kind of a faint gauzy rainbow and, around the sun. So it's really very unique. And it's definitely, when you see them, they don't happen that often. When you see them, figure out a way to photograph them. And so this is a shot that I took recently in the Badlands just about a week and a half ago. This wicked thunderstorm came through. And I get so excited being there in the summer. It's a miserable time to be there. The days are really long. The nights are short. You barely get any sleep. And sometimes it can be really hot during the day, but it's that heat that builds up these massive thunderstorms in the Great Plains. And so this night, that storm came rolling through, and it passed just to the north of where I was. And so it was crazy because the wind just picked up. The wind started howling, and you could smell the rain in the air. And I looked at the radar on the app on my phone, the weather app, and I could see that the rain was going to pass just to the north of me. So I wasn't going to get rained on, and I knew that there was a very low risk of getting struck by lightning because the storm was passing in the distance. And so after it passed, I just sat there for about an hour in the fading sunset twilight, photographing lightning. And the lightning was flashing like every split second. It wasn't even a full second between bolts. They were like just bolts going all over the place. It was crazy. And so I wasn't using a lightning trigger for this shot. Just got a question from Craig about whether I was doing that. This is actually a long exposure, 30-second exposure. And this was taken in that faint twilight because I did a long enough exposure. It ends up looking relatively bright, even though it was very dark to the eye. And so I was just trying to capture a lot of big bolts during that 30-second exposure. And I just kept shooting over and over again. The wind was blowing. I had to hold on to my tripod and just push it down as much as I could because the wind kept on trying to knock it over. It was a crazy experience, but it was incredible. And it's really just the kind of thing that I love to use. I've got a question here from Don about what weather app I use. I mean, you can use pretty much any weather app. I like to go to the source, weather.gov, which is the website of the National Weather Service. And they've got this great hour-by-hour weather graph for any location. And it gives you all sorts of really interesting data. So all the weather apps are just taking their weather from the National Weather Service. So the app that I use is called Storm Team 10. It's basically a Green Bay, Wisconsin local weather station. And so there's nothing particularly great about the app versus other apps. I just like the way that it shows the radar display versus some other apps. I don't know why. I just like the fact that it kind of shows you real clouds and stuff like that. It doesn't give you this computer generated cloud information. So it looks like a real satellite image. So I like that personally, but really you can use any weather app. It doesn't really matter. They're all getting the weather data from the same place. Oh, so we got a comment. So nice to observe that people still capture landscapes with the camera in the landscape horizontal mode. That's a great comment. I would say that, I don't know, maybe 10% of my landscape photos are actually shot landscape.
I love to shoot landscape, but I agree. Yeah, Instagram has made a lot of people into vertical photographers these days.
Yeah. Well, and I've always shot a lot of verticals landscape because it allows you to bring in a lot of foreground and a lot of cloud in the sky at the same time. And it's a lot harder to do even with a wide angle lens when you're shooting horizontal. But I don't know. I probably shoot that landscape format about 20% of the time. But yeah, I love shooting verticals. And I know that Sean does as well, though, a lot of these images from Sean are actually shot in the horizontal format. So I thought we would very quickly wrap things up with this final image, Sean, which I think takes us back to the beginning where you had that beautiful hoarfrost. And I think this shot really brings home the point how you need a lot of snow and you need a lot of deep snow and you need fresh snow to really make winter images look that powerful and strong.
Yeah, snow to me is probably the most challenging photography situation in the landscape for me, especially because where we live here, when you're going to get snow and how much snow you're going to get is somewhat variable. It's not cold all winter long, and so we go long periods without any good new snow. But for me, being out directly at the end of a snowstorm and being able to time that also with the light and morning or afternoon or whenever the good light is the challenge. And I always have a goal that I'm going to be out photographing and do a lot of winter photography. And so I photographed this in December last year, at the end of last year. And I thought, oh, this is a great start to a good winter of photography. And then this was the last time, it was the one and only time there was snow like this that I had a chance to go out and photograph. But there was a big snowstorm. It was cold. It snowed all the way to the valley floor. I also saw that the storm was going to be ending near sunrise. So I went out in the dark at 5 a.m. This is about an hour away from where I live, and drove to this spot. And it was before the snowplows had been able to come out. So I'm plowing through 1 foot to 2 feet of snow up into the mountains to get to this spot in my, fortunately I have a 4-wheel drive vehicle. I'm used to driving in the snow. But it was dicey on whether I was going to actually make it or not, or end up in the ditch and wait for the snowplows to have to come through and get me out, which I'm sure they wouldn't have appreciated. But it really paid off. Because when I got there, that snow was pristine. The snow was just finishing falling. The light was just starting to come through. It was as new and fresh fallen snow as you can get. And like I said, it's so rare to be able to find that you just have to, take the opportunities you have. Because like I said, I got one chance, or actually 2 chances all last winter.
Yeah. And that, I think that is one of the most difficult things about getting great winter images, is that whenever you do get that big dump of snow that's going to give you the perfect conditions for photography, that's when the roads are at their worst. And that's when it's the most difficult to get to a location. And of course, when you get to the location, you've got to be worried because you park your car somewhere, you come back, it might be buried by snow. A snowplow can go by and just bury your car. So there's all these challenges to winter photography that most people don't really think about. And it makes it very, very difficult to get effective winter images. Well, that is all we've got time for. Thank you very much, everyone, for all of your great comments and questions. And thank you, of course, Sean, for coming on. Sean Bagshaw, definitely check out his website. Great photographer, great guy, great photo educator. Thank you so much, Sean, for coming on. Would love to have you back sometime.
My pleasure, Ian. Anytime.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.